We are so excited to have Sara Goldman, the Accessibility Coordinator for the City of Pasadena, with us here today to talk about navigating work with a disability. This is such an important topic. Over half of the LADN members surveyed in our 2025 annual survey reported being too ill to work at all. So we know in the LADN community just how challenging it can be to find accessible employment, and we are so grateful to have Sara sharing her expertise with us. Before I introduce Sara and hand things off to her, I just want to give a brief introduction to LADN for anyone who is joining us for the first time. So LADN is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to providing mental health, community, education, and financial support for people impacted by dysautonomia. We provide regular support groups for teen and adult patients, as well as for caregivers. And we know just how isolating a chronic illness can be. So we are committed to providing community events, things like our Cyclit Book Club, movie nights, and our peer networking program, which will be taking new members right after our April 19th fundraiser. So keep a lookout. You are obviously joining us for one of our educational offerings, and we try to provide lectures, workshops, and resources on a variety of topics that might support the dysautonomia experience. We also offer healthcare access grants to help low-income patients access medical care. This program opens every October. The LADN staff, myself, Emily, and Gabby all have personal experience with dysautonomia. And with your help, we strive to make LADN a community resource where people with dysautonomia can feel supported and know that they are not alone in this challenging journey. So I hope you can all join us for our April 19th Unity and Community event that happens in Pasadena. It's from 12 to 3 p.m. It will be a super fun event. Pie and Burger Restaurant will have their food truck there and is donating 100% of sales. There'll be auctions, raffles, speeches, and it's just a wonderful opportunity to gather as a community while also helping to spread awareness and to provide year-round funding for LADN. So you can get your free tickets at our website, la-dn.org, and we'll put the direct link in the chat. But yeah, hope you can join us. And it's also a great place to invite friends and family to, maybe anyone you sort of want to learn a bit more about dysautonomia. It's a pretty low stakes way to gather some info. So without any further ado, I am so pleased to welcome Sara Goldman. Sara is the Accessibility Coordinator for the City of Pasadena. Prior to this role, she worked for the Pasadena Public Health Department in Emergency Preparedness and helped to get our city through the pandemic. Sara attended the University of Toledo, where she obtained a Master of Public Health degree in epidemiology and a Master of Science in biological sciences, concentrating in medical sciences. She enjoys providing training to public and private entities in Pasadena regarding disability access and inclusion, fostering a community that is welcoming and accessible to all, which we are so grateful for. In her free time, Sara likes to garden and read books when she isn't chasing her 1.5-year-old son and 2 cats. Sara, we are so pleased to have you join us. Thank you for the work that you do and for sharing your expertise with us today. So I'm going to hand it off to you. You are co-host, so hopefully you are able to share your screen.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and pull up my slides now. So please let me know if you can see my screen share.
Yes.
Okay, great. So today I'm going to be talking to you in my capacity as a trainer through the ADA National Network's Trainer Leadership Network. So I do serve as the City of Pasadena's Accessibility Coordinator, but I am wearing a different hat today. So I want to preface my presentation by saying that this is not the official advice or legal stance of the City of Pasadena. This is information that I have learned and will be sharing as a part of this ADA national network of trainers. So today I'm going to be talking about reasonable accommodations in general, about how to talk to your employer when you may be disclosing a disability or navigating the reasonable accommodations process. And then, we'll also talk about the actual hiring process and considerations that you may make as a person with a disability when navigating that process. I've also I've provided Emily and Sally with some supplementary materials. So we're going to be sharing materials with you after this presentation, things like a sample job accommodations request letter, some lists of typical accommodations that people, especially people with chronic illness, may request in the workplace. But we're going to start by going through the slides, and we'll also have some time at the end for a question and answer today. So, we're going to start with talking about reasonable accommodations. This is really a quick overview of the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, Title I provisions surrounding reasonable accommodations. So, I'm really focusing today on the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. There are lots of other laws that pertain to employees, like FMLA and things like that, and they may give slightly different guidance, but today we're talking about the ADA. So I just want to make sure that we have a good understanding of that. And as always, a quick legal disclaimer that this training is not intended as legal advice. There are resources that I'm going to be providing to you that may be able to provide legal advice to you. But especially when we're talking about the reasonable accommodations process and disability disclosures, it's a highly personalized, very individualized process where the choice to disclose is individual, and also the process, the interactive process of seeking and receiving accommodations is on a case by case basis. So there's never a one size fits all, but these are the general laws and rules that apply to it and how you may apply them to your own life. So most employers are already offering accommodations, and they may not even be aware that what they're doing is in accordance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's really any time an employer has done anything differently to allow someone to stay in their job and be effective. So that's an accommodation. So one thing that a lot of employers might do is ergonomic assessments. I'm currently sitting in a chair that was not the original chair in my office. I use a mouse that is a different mouse than the one that was originally handed to me. And this was all provided as a part of an ergonomic assessment that was done by my occupational safety team here at my workplace. And that would be considered an accommodation that could be a part of the interactive process for disabilities. Another thing is in our office, as in many offices, we have the bright fluorescent lights that are horrible. They're so torturous. And something that was requested by staff and that was granted was having dimmer switches, so that we could have a control over the brightness of the light in our offices. That's another example of an accommodation. One more that I'm experiencing now is I'm currently almost 20 weeks pregnant. And so I have disclosed my pregnancy to my employer, and I have requested and received the opportunity for flexibility to go to medical appointments and to work remotely. Luckily, I'm out of the first trimester, so some of the nausea has subsided. I don't need to work remotely as much as I may have previously, but them offering me that opportunity is a job-related accommodation. So these are all things that minimize the chance of injury, maximize comfort, and maximize productivity on the job. So this presentation is really organized around the 10 key questions that you see here on this slide about reasonable accommodations in the workplace. It's mostly based on the legal provisions around Title I of the ADA that talks about reasonable accommodation, but it does contain some additional human and practical issues that are related to this topic. So as I go through these 10 questions, if you guys could all use let's see, do we have the reactions allowed here where people can like do a thumbs up or something like that? So if I'm reading a question and it really strikes home with you, please give me a reaction on the screen. I'd love to see what all of you are most interested in so that we can focus on that. The 10 things you need to know about disability-based accommodations. What is an accommodation? What are some examples of typical accommodations? How much does it really cost to provide workplace accommodations? Who can get accommodations? Who's eligible? Can accommodations requests be denied? How is an accommodation request triggered? How is it decided upon? Can medical documentation be collected? Who can be told about my accommodations request? And how can we make it work? Okay, great. So it seems like we have some varied interest in a lot of these, and we're going to cover all of these topics today. But if there are things that I've covered and you still have lingering questions, please drop them in the chat for Emily and Sally to see, so that we can discuss them at the end when we get to question and answer. So starting out, what is a reasonable accommodation? It's really any change in the work environment or in the way that we do things at the workplace that allows someone with a disability to enjoy equal employment opportunities. Most employers are already doing accommodations, but they don't call them that. They're not aware of it. It's any change that's made to make sure that someone can fully contribute. This definition that I'm providing today is one that was put forth by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. But they don't just apply to on-the-job functions. So it's not just when you're in the role. Job applicants also have a right to have an accommodation in order to fully participate in the hiring process. And those accommodations also apply to the benefits of employment. So, for example, you may require an accommodation in order to attend a training session or a conference. So, if this benefit of attending trainings or conferences would be given to any other employee in your similar job class, then you may still need accommodations in order to do so. What are some examples of accommodations? So I'm giving you some examples on the screen. Again, I've provided you with some supplementary resources that go more in depth about some common accommodation requests, but it's this list here on the screen is not exhaustive. It's just a brief overview of what is typically meant by an accommodation. And these might apply to people with all sorts of functional disability types, not just non-visible disabilities or chronic illness. So the first example is an example of an auxiliary aid or service for employees that may have a visual impairment. So that's using a screen reader or audio text softwares. Other auxiliary aids and services might be having an interpreter available or captioning for employees who are deaf or hard of hearing. Having a change in schedule might include allowing someone to leave early a couple days a week for medical appointments or having flexibility in start and stop times depending on need. Uh, Changes in break times might allow someone to take breaks according to their medication schedule or to plan rest periods according to a doctor's orders. May need to take more breaks at a shorter duration in order to accommodate their needs, or they may need a singular longer break. Uh, Job aids are tools that might help an employee, so they help direct, guide, or help improve the efficiency of someone's note work. And it may seem like something that's really formal, but it can be as informal as having sticky notes, instruction sheets, online help, posters, different smartphone features, or web plugins. So it can be really creative based on your need. A change in work location. Um, or the environment. Even if your employer doesn't have a work from home policy, they are required to consider the possibility of allowing someone to work from home as an accommodation if their disability prevent them from being present in the workplace. And here's the and being uh, present in the workplace is not an essential function of the job. So there are some jobs where being present in the workplace is essential to the nature. If you're an administrative assistant, for example, and your job is welcoming people to the office, receiving deliveries, locking and unlocking the door, etc., then being present in the workplace may be essential to the nature of your job. But if it's not essential, then it needs to be a consideration. And moving your work location or environment may be within the office as well. Perhaps you're in the middle of a cubicle farm, right? And it's really loud and distracting, and you need a quieter, more remote space. You may be moved to a different cubicle or to a standalone office, and that may be an accommodation request, right? Uh, the last three here, so elimination or exchange of marginal job tasks. This is kind of where we're getting into the nitty-gritty, what's an essential versus what's a marginal job task. Essential job tasks need to be performed, right? And employers do not need to grant an accommodation if it means that the employee can no longer perform the essential functions of their job. But if there's other ancillary tasks, the like other duties as assigned sort of things that you can't do due to your disability, those could be eliminated or exchanged in order for other tasks as a reasonable accommodation. Now, These last two, reassignment and leave, are the most contentious of accommodation types, right? Getting a lateral move or a demotion or taking leave. Uh, but they're often what employers think of first when they think of accommodation requests. They're not thinking of all these other creative, often low cost and very simple solutions. So as much as possible, we really want to think of these as a last resort. We want to find effective accommodations that are creative and flexible and keep the person engaged in their job. So these last two are really the accommodations of last resort. How much does it cost? This is one that's like the employers are really thinking about it, right? And when you're thinking about reasonable accommodations, the cost would generally be on the employer to provide that accommodation. And employers and businesses often vastly overestimate the cost of accommodations. So the process can go a lot more smoothly and maybe better received if you, as the employee or the job seeker, if you have a good idea of what accommodations you need, what might be effective, so that they can do some pricing if a price is even involved. A lot of times accommodations are free. But you can see it. About half of workplace accommodations cost nothing, 56%. And even when there was a one-time expense, maybe you're purchasing some adaptive equipment or something, the median cost was about $300. And when ongoing, so you need to provide a subscription service or provide interpretation services, something like that that's repeated, it's still under $2,000 a year, which is a relatively low cost to a business. The employer is responsible for providing the accommodation. There are some tax credits that are available for providing some sort types of modifications. Um, if you have questions about financial incentives, you want to tell your employer about financial incentives, you can contact. So there's some links that are available in the slides, which Emily and Sally will provide you the slides so that you can check those links. And then you can also always contact the ADA Center. And I'm going to drop into the chat right now a phone number that you can always call and ask for advice through the ADA Center. So it's 800-949-4232. All right, so next we're thinking about who can get accommodations. So when we're talking about the reasonable accommodation process, this is a part of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So this is really talking about qualified individuals with a disability, people who meet the ADA's legal definition of disability. There may be other definitions of disability that might apply to other laws like FMLA. But when we're talking about reasonable accommodations, we're talking about the ADA. So this is a person who has a physical or mental impairment that severely limits their ability to perform one or more major life activities: eating, breathing, sleeping, learning, driving, etc. So qualified individuals, you have to be a qualified individual with a disability. So first you're disabled and then you're qualified. You have the skills, experience, education that's necessary to perform those essential functions of the job with or without that accommodation. So just because you need an accommodation, it doesn't mean that you're unqualified, right? That's a really common misperception. And an individual is only unqualified if the disability is such that any accommodation would cause undue hardship or direct threat to the employer. And we'll go over what those specific legal terms, undue hardship and direct threat, mean a little bit later in today's presentation. Every applicant has the right to be considered in the application process, and applicants cannot be excluded from the process because they need an accommodation. So again, we're talking about full and part-time employees, seasonal and temporary workers. There's a little bit of gray area when it comes to what's called contract workers. So anyone who's on payroll is automatically entitled to accommodations. But contract workers, so if you're from a staffing firm or you're contracted out, that gets a little bit more complicated and the EEOC can give you some more policy. But if you're a seasonal, part-time, full-time employee, you are entitled to the accommodations process. And employers are also only required to provide accommodations in regards to known disabilities. So that's where the disclosure part comes into play. We're going to talk about disclosures in more detail later on in the presentation, but what you need to know is that in order to qualify for accommodations, to be able to participate in this process, you either need to disclose or your employer must have a reasonable belief that you are in need of an accommodation. You don't need to use any legal or medical language to disclose. You can ask in plain language. It can be written or verbal. It's any statement that would indicate that the person, the individual, has a disability which impacts the essential functions of their job. It can be casual in conversation in a one-on-one with your supervisor, or it could be in the form of a written letter. So, speaking of disclosure, how is the accommodations process triggered? This really starts the first time anyone says, I'm having a little bit of trouble doing X part of my job because of my disability. So we're going to focus on how the accommodations process is triggered here. What has to happen for the employer to know that the interactive process needs to start? Usually, after you open this floor up, right? And it may be coming from you, it might be coming from a caregiver, or it could even come from a parent or relative. Uh, Again, in plain language or in a letter, but ideally, once you make that disclosure, your employer within 2 weeks or so should be contacting you to set up a meeting or request additional information to help with the accommodations process. That's called initiating the interactive process, where you go back and forth with your employer to find out if they are able to fulfill your accommodations as requested, or if not, what might be some alternatives. So employers can sometimes hold up this process because they don't understand that a disclosure has triggered the accommodations process. So, depending on the structure of your employer, they may or may not have like a fully structured HR. Even if they do, they may not have HR professionals who are really well informed about this process. So, just because they don't understand doesn't eliminate their need, their legal requirement to uh, start in the process. But you may need to, in your accommodation request letter or in your advocacy, you may need to note what the process looks like. And that's going to be up to you based on your knowledge and comfortability with your employer. It may be that they have a great process that's already laid out, uh, and it may be that you need to do a little bit of educating too. And the Job Accommodations Network has a lot of really great resources about accommodations in general, but specifically about making disclosures and writing accommodations requests. So I'm dropping into the chat now a sample accommodation request letter from JAN, the Job Accommodations Network. But I've also provided to Emily and Sally a sample accommodation letter that's specific to people with POTS, so that you can see an example of a letter that might be someone with dysautonomia. All right, here's a big one. Can accommodation requests be denied? Yes, in very specific certain circumstances. So the two major reasons that an accommodation request would be denied is due to undue hardship and for safety reasons. Undue hardship is defined on a case by case basis. You can't automatically say, as a blanket statement, providing ergonomic chairs is an undue hardship for us. You have to assess somebody's individual request, and you have to look at alternatives if you think that something is an undue hardship. The determination is also made in consideration of the entire financial resources of the organization. So when you have an organization like the one that I work for, our city is made up of departments. Within those departments, there are divisions, there are programs, there are services. And if my program is saying we don't have enough uh, funds to cover your accommodation, then they need to go up the line and they need to look at the division's resources, the department's resources, and the entire city budget at large before they say that it's an undue hardship. And they also need to consider any tax incentives that they would receive by providing this accommodation or any other assistance that they may be able to provide. So, uh, for expenses, again, there's no set dollar amount. You can't say like X dollars is too expensive, because it depends on the business. It depends on the organizational resources that are at hand. So I unfortunately I can't tell you like, oh, this accommodation request is cost effective and would be okay, and this one is too expensive because it depends. It depends on your employer and their resources and your needs. When we're talking about difficulty, so employers are not required to provide an accommodation if it's considered quote unquote, unduly expensive, substantial, or disruptive, uh, or those that would fundamentally alter the nature or operation of the business or organization. When we're talking about a fundamental alteration, an example that I like to use is if I was a line cook and I was requesting the accommodation of having my service animal join me in the workplace. Well, having a service animal in the kitchen where I'm cooking at a restaurant would be a violation of health and safety code. So it would be a fundamental alteration to the operation of the business. When we're talking about disruption, this can also be a source of undue hardship. It's a reasonable accommodation that's unduly extensive, substantial. Um, so they need to make sure that it's concrete and substantial. A minor inconvenience or some sort of assumption that they're making about disruption is not valid as an undue hardship. They can't say, well, I think that if we do this accommodation for you, people will complain. Or I think that if we provide this accommodation for you, you may not be able to do X, Y, and Z. They need to know for sure, concretely, that that is true before they consider it an undue hardship. So we also need to think about direct threat. This is a direct threat to the health or safety of others. Employers, of course, have the right to mitigate truly dangerous situations, but direct threat needs to be legitimate, probable, and concrete. Any sort of assumption or idea of a possible future threat, it doesn't apply here. It's problematic. And then again, when we think about the marginal versus essential job functions, with an accommodation, you still need to perform those essential functions of your job, but you may be able to eliminate or exchange marginal functions. So, how do we decide an accommodation? This is where we start to think about the fact that there's really no one size fits all. Disabilities can change over time, so an accommodation that may be required for you at one point in your life may not be required at all times. So the accommodation process is really individualized and may need to be reassessed over time. And this is done through what's called the interactive process. And it's not just a science, it's communication, it's flexibility, it's creativity. Employers need to be encouraged sometimes to think more broadly and more creatively to find a better way of doing things. And there are so many times when the search for an accommodation actually just finds a way to improve job processes for everyone. As we know in general in the disability world, a lot of times modifications and improvements not only improve the lives of people with disabilities, but for all people. And it's the same with job accommodations. So there may be a better way of doing things, better job aids, better communication channels. So the individual requesting the accommodations is the best source of information. They know best what they need, how they need it, when, how long, etc. But the employer ultimately decides yes or no and in what way. And they may be the one to offer alternatives if the original request is not possible. And the most expensive accommodation may not always be the best thing. It may be that that's what you need. So you're going to always consider the person with a disability and what they need to be able to do in order to perform their job and the environment in which the job is performed. So we want to really identify an effective accommodation. And that may or may not be the accommodation that was originally requested, because it's going to be a collaboration, a compromise between employee and employer to find the best course of action that works for everyone. Here's another big one. Can medical documentation be collected? Yes, is the quick and easy answer. Employers are permitted to collect medical information that supports making an accommodation decision. Oftentimes, this is going to be most requested. It may be that they do a policy as a blanket for everybody, but it may only be when the disability is not immediately apparent. So it may be more common for people with non-visible disabilities. Employers are not required to collect medical information, so they may or may not ask for it, and you don't need to provide it up front. You can say it will be available upon request, right? Because you don't need to just open the door and provide everything, open the floodgates to information. You can wait, see what they request, and provide things as requested. Because employers only have the ability to collect medical documentation that is job related and consistent with business necessity. So you probably have a lot more medical documentation that is extraneous. And we really don't want to give an employer more than they need. So they may request us a certain specific amount of information, and you can ask your doctor or medical provider, whomever is providing this documentation, to provide that as requested, rather than just handing over your entire medical record, which is going to provide a lot more information than they need. All collected medical information must be kept confidential. It must be kept separate from the employee's work file. All right, so we've requested an accommodation. We've successfully received an accommodation. Amazing. Who else can be told that I have requested or received an accommodation? So, yes, employers can collect that medical information. They need to maintain a separate confidential file for medical information. So, I just want to really emphasize that even if someone is being told about your accommodation or a change in the way that you're doing your work, they should not be given details about your disability or any medical information. So when you have a coworker who may be directly impacted by your accommodation, maybe you shared a space and the space is going to be changing, or your hours may be changing, or they may be delegated some of those marginal tasks that were previously yours, or you may be exchanging tasks. In those cases where the coworker will be directly impacted, your employer can let them know that there's going to be a change in the way that you do your job, but they cannot share why, because doing so would amount to a disclosure of disability, and confidentiality is really important. So, this is a source of great consternation for employers. As an employee, it's not really your problem, it's the employer's problem. But it can be helpful for you to know some of the ways that they can go about this, especially in case they're not getting it quite right. So employers are often concerned about what to tell coworkers who may feel that employees who are given accommodations are receiving special treatment. Uh, if asked, an employer can say that they are complying with the law by providing a change in the workplace. But it's really important that they provide clear policies to all employees about the availability of accommodations in accordance with the law. This can be communicated in employee handbooks, on websites, in orientation, posted signs, with information that goes out with pay stubs. They should include all of those laws under which employees might ask for a change in environment, like ADA, FMLA, etc. And they should also stress, very importantly, that they value employee privacy and will not share with coworkers why any one employee was granted an accommodation. So this is really important for the people that are managing the accommodations process to know, like in HR or leadership. But it's really important as well for direct managers and supervisors, because they're the folks that are interacting with you as the person that's receiving the employee and your coworkers every day. So how can we make accommodations work? Uh, Employers are required to make a good faith effort to find an accommodation that works. Hopefully, it's exactly the accommodation as requested by the employee. But even if not, they need to look into finding an effective accommodation, even if that means testing things out and having some false starts. So you might need to do something for a trial period. You realize that it's not the most effective accommodation and you try something else out. That is also a part of that interactive process. Employers can't jump too quickly to the conclusion that the employee's disability cannot be accommodated. Before you jump to that conclusion, you need to try out maybe multiple different accommodations and realize that they may take some getting used to. There may be a learning curve, especially if it's involving new devices or equipment. And it absolutely requires checking in with the employee periodically to make sure that that accommodation is still effective. Uh, A lot of larger organizations have centralized accommodation units. A lot of times those are through HR, so that they can use this expertise effectively and make sure that managers and supervisors aren't disincentivized to provide accommodations that come out of their own departmental budget. But it may be that in your business and your employer that you're just going through your direct supervisor or something like that. Um, Again, remember, not all accommodations are equal. Those last two, leave, reassignment, those are absolutely resorts. We want to explore all of our options before we go with leave or reassignment. And the biggest element of accommodation, of disability disclosure in general, is trust. There's some relatively recent research from Cornell that really emphasizes the importance of having a climate of trust within the workplace. So if you want to learn more about that, I'm going to drop a link into the chat. But the big thing to think about with trust is that if employees are overall fearful that coming forward with an accommodation need is going to be the first step on their road to termination, they're probably not going to come forward at all, even though their disability may impact their job performance, and an accommodation would very simply, easily, and cost effectively allow them to perform their job at the level of excellence that is required, right? So having this trust is really to the benefit of both the employee and the employer. We're going to save our questions for the end. But again, there's some resources here. The Job Accommodations Network, I'll probably mention this a million more times throughout today's presentation. It's an amazing resource. If we have some time, we'll go through some of the pages together. So I really encourage you to check that out. And then also the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has a lot of the legality, the laws surrounding what employers can and can't do, what they must do in terms of providing accommodations. So next, we're going to move into talking to employers about disability. The this what I want to emphasize is that this module doesn't make the assumption that you've already decided to disclose or discuss a disability, and it doesn't even assume that disclosure is always the right option. It's really I want to give you a framework so that you can choose whether disclosure is right for you and how to discuss what your accommodation needs are if you want to disclose. I really want to focus on understanding your rights around telling someone about a disability and coming to a decision that's right for you. There's no one way that's right for everyone. Some people will want to tell an employer right away about a disability, others will not, and that's totally fine. The material is going to cover both the job application process as well as employment. And the only time an employer needs to be told about a disability is when an employee requests an accommodation. So we'll also talk about some things might want to consider if you're considering disclosure. And this one, of course, really applies more to people with non-visible disabilities. People with visible disabilities, the disclosure may be inherent. So the choice to disclose oftentimes lies with people with non-visible disabilities. So when can an employer ask about disability during the application process? They cannot, during the application process, ask questions that are likely to reveal the existence of a disability. And you do not have to uh, tell an employer about a disability, even if you think you're going to need an accommodation after you've been hired. So you can choose to disclose, but you are not required to as an applicant. So when we're thinking about the kinds of questions that employers might ask during the application process, I'm going to pose a few questions here, and then maybe you can drop in the chat if you think any of these questions would be okay for an employer to ask under the ADA. So the first question you might hear is, do you have any disabilities which would prevent you from doing this job? Do we think that's okay? Not okay? Got an open the chat. Will you need an accommodation to be able to do this job? Got some no's again. Got some yeses. Have you ever collected workers' compensation? Have you been hospitalized in the past year? And are you currently taking any prescription medications? All right, so we got some varied responses. I'm really heartened to see a lot of no's because the reality is none of these questions are permitted in an application process. Uh, and especially when we're talking about uh, do you need an accommodation or have you ever collected workers' comp? Those it might confuse you, right? And you might get these questions. So what do you do if one of these questions appears during an application or interview? Should you just go? Yeah, some people are saying in the chat that they've seen all these questions, and some questions about what's the best way to answer. So we're actually going to cover that later in the module. We're going to go through, okay, if an employer is asking you these inappropriate questions, what the heck do I do? I noticed that some of the links are not working. I apologize. I'll make sure to get you corrected links for the ones that are not working. This one I do know. I have it pulled up right now, so I know that it's working. But there's a great page, again, from Jan, the Job Accommodations Network, about dealing with improper requests for medical documentation from an employer. Yeah, sometimes they'll pose it indirectly. They'll try and be sneaky. So those are the ones where they know that they're not allowed to ask certain questions, but especially when people have a visible disability or it's apparent through the way that they are answering questions and things like that, they may try to go about it in a roundabout way. So we can talk about those kinds of situations. Okay, so uh, after an offer has been made, but before starting work, a lot of times employees are required to take medical exams that are job related and consistent with business necessity or safety. So before work has started, but after an offer has been made, the employers are permitted to collect some medical information. So they might have a medical exam, you might have a drug test, etc. Um, but needing a reasonable accommodation does not make you unqualified for the job. Uh, if the exam reveals a disability, they can only rescind the job offer if the disability can't be accommodated or if there's a direct threat. So even if that medical exam in itself discloses your disability, it doesn't mean that they can then just rescind the job offer. They need to then go through the interactive process to find a reasonable accommodation. And if they then, because of that medical examination, they believe that a person with a known disability might require accommodation, then it is okay at that point in the process to ask what is needed to perform the tasks. But they can still only ask uniformly if you need accommodations in order to participate. Um, unless you specifically requested an accommodation at that point. So I have some examples that might be helpful here. So the first is if we have an applicant who uses a wheelchair and they apply for a job that involve retrieval of files that would seem to be beyond reach range for a wheelchair user. The employer can then show this individual the location of the files and ask them to explain or demonstrate how they would perform that task and if they would need an accommodation to do so. If we have an employee, so due to an injury, we have an employee that has a severe limp and uses a cane because of their prosthetic leg. So they had an amputation. And they plan to return to their assembly line job. It doesn't require employees to move around. They're standing in the assembly line, but it does require that they stand for long periods of time. The employer asks this individual about their ability to stand and whether they will need reasonable accommodation to perform the job. And they reply, yes, I do need an accommodation. So, what are some examples? So, the employee then provided two possibilities of accommodations that would work for them. One, a tall stool so that they can sit down but still reach the conveyor belt, or a sit stand chair, which would provide support and let them do the functions of the job. Um, so, sometimes employers are going to be aware of a disability because it's obvious. Uh, because like when a person is a wheelchair user, but other times, such as with non-visible disabilities, the applicant chooses to disclose. But either way, the same strict confidentiality requirements apply. So even if you have an apparent disability, the same confidentiality requirements apply, and it applies whether you voluntarily reveal the information or if it's in response to like something that's discovered in a medical exam. All right, so I've said a few times now that employers are required to accommodate known disabilities. So if there's an unknown disability, of course, the employer is not required to make an accommodation for it. So generally, that takes the form of disclosure. The employee, the worker, tells their employer that they have a disability that's impacting their jobs. Sometimes it might be that a service provider, a caregiver, informs the employer about a disability. Um, but employers can't make blanket inquiries of all employees about their disability status. So you can't just say, tell me your disability status and if you require accommodations. It's sort of a request basis here. Um, so anyone who needs an accommodation needs to disclose their disability in order to engage in that interactive process. And this is really important because if you are unable to perform the essential functions of your job because you need an accommodation and you have not disclosed your disability and you get some sort of reprimand, right? You're put on a PIP or you're put in for coaching of some sort. And then at that point you say, oh, well, I got a write-up, but this write-up is because of my disability and I needed an accommodation. Well, that's great. Now we can move forward with the interactive process, but we can't get rid of that write-up because at that point in time of the write-up, your employer did not know about your disability. They may have suspected, but it was not known to them. And so they can't go back in time and undo that. So if you have a feeling like you're going to need it and it might impact your ability to perform your job, then for you, disclosure may be the best path forward. Because if you wait until you've already received some sort of write-up or other reprimand, then of course, moving forward, you can go through the interactive process, but you can't go back and undo something. All right, so medical documentation and confidentiality, we've kind of already covered this, so I'm not going to spend too long. But the ADA, again, it prohibits disclosure of medical information. All you can say is that they're receiving an accommodation, not what it is, right? That there are laws that protect employees and protect their privacy. Um, and again, having that conversation is your employer's problem, kind of not yours. But if you want to provide them with some guidance about how you are comfortable with them talking about it, that's up to you. Again, don't wait until your performance has been compromised before you request an accommodation. Even if you don't know that you have the right to an accommodation, that's really common. If you're afraid you're going to be judged or fired, if you don't want coworkers to know, or you think you can, just squeak on by, like I can just push through it. Um, if that ends up not being the case and your job performance is compromised, but your employer doesn't know about the disability, then you don't have those protections. When you're making a disclosure or requesting an accommodation, you don't need to use any specialized legal or medical terms. You can use plain language. You just need to tell your employer that you have a disability, that it's impacting your job performance, and you need an accommodation. You can tell your direct supervisor, you can tell HR. It depends on the structure of your organization and who you're most comfortable with. All right, so the interactive process. This is a really specific requirement under the ADA is engaging in this interactive process. So after you inform your employer that you need an accommodation, they have a role to play, and so do you. So the employer cannot ignore accommodation requests. They should respond quickly, and they should begin this interactive process. Ultimately, the employer makes the final decision about what accommodation will be used, but they should take into account the employee's views of what type of accommodation they think will be the most effective. So you, as the employee, should be prepared to talk about how your disability impacts your ability to do your job, what accommodations may be best for you. If there is a cost to it, you could talk to them about resources or incentives, um, if you are feeling especially helpful. And you should also be prepared for them to not get it 100% right. So having resources at hand like the Job Accommodations Network or calling the ADA National Network or centers is always helpful to you when you are starting to go into the specifics of your process. So deciding whether or not to disclose is a really, really personal decision. Two people with the same disability might make different decisions about if and how to disclose a disability with a current or potential employer. And again, this key issue here is trust. Do you trust that your employer will respond effectively with trust and respect? Is there fear? Is this fear justified? Um, and there's no one size fits all. So you want to be prepared if you decide to discuss your disability. How does your disability impact your job? How might it change over time? What are some options or resources that are going to help you to effectively perform your job? Think about, don't tell the employer what their concerns might be, but just think about what they might have concerns of, because they may not have these concerns. It may be things that you are worried about, but it's unfounded. So don't come to the meeting and say, I know you're worried about this, this, and the other, because they may not have been worried about that at all. But then when you say it, they're like, huh, I am worried about this now that you've said it. So don't bring that up preemptively, but be prepared. Just like when you're preparing for an interview with questions that might be asked, think about what their concerns might be and how you might respond. Are there any valid safety concerns? How can those valid concerns be addressed? And how will you deal with concerns that are not valid? So when they have these preconceived notions or these suppositions that really are just their own issues, how are you going to respond to those questions? And then you want to make sure that you avoid these pitfalls. So again, don't wait until your disability has seriously impacted your job performance. You don't need to discuss disability too early or unnecessarily if it has no impact on the job. You might want to. If you feel comfortable and your workplace is a comfortable place, then disclosure may be a no-brainer for you. But if you're concerned about it, you don't need to do it until the time is right. Once you're disclosing, once you're requesting accommodations, don't provide too much information. Employers and coworkers, they don't usually need any sort of detailed information about your diagnosis, your treatment, etc. Uh, don't provide too little information. You want to make sure that you do respond to valid requests for information, and make sure that to the best of your ability, you're prepared. So I can't emphasize enough that don't wait until it's too late to disclose is like the most important. Um, this is the case even if you don't have a high level of trust in your employer, unfortunately. If you have a fear that your disability will impact your performance, it is in your best interest to open up those legal protections and start the process sooner rather than later. You're accountable for your performance. So if you request an accommodation because performance issues have been raised, yes, they should put on hold any additional performance reviews until the effective accommodation is put in place. But again, they can't retroactively rescind that negative performance eval that was done before you requested an accommodation. Oops, did I skip one? And then, so there is a checklist, but I think for the sake of time, we're gonna skip this today. But it's one of the resources that I've provided to Emily and Sally, and so it'll still go through, and it kind of gives you some things to think about in terms of, are you ready to do this today? Do you need support in order to do it, or do you need to do some more preparation and learning before you're ready to do something? So like understanding your rights and responsibilities, understanding how your disability might impact the main functions of your job, etc. All right, so now we're going to move into the last section for today, and then we'll open up the floor for some questions and we'll go through some of the resources, time permitting. So this last module here is really for job seekers with disabilities, and it covers some of the legal, human, and practical issues surrounding the hiring process. Um, And it's really been designed to go beyond those legal issues, things that we talked about in the last module, and address some of the more human and practical aspects of job seeking. It's a tough world out here in the job markets. So before we talk about some of those difficulties, I do want to talk about some hope and some positive changes. Um, I fully understand if some of you have come to this workshop today with a lot of frustration or hopelessness. This is so understandable. People with disabilities absolutely continue to face hiring discrimination today, but there is reason to hope. Right? We do have protections. So the ADA Amendments Act expanded the definition of disability. So when the ADA first came out, there was a lot of legal challenges that were really limiting in terms of defining disability. And then they passed the ADA Amendments Act or the ADA, so many A's, and that expanded the protections to more people under the law. Um, and you can learn more about that through the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Uh, the gap between educational levels of people with and without disabilities is also lessening. So, over the past several decades, there's been a reduction in the gap in education between people with and without disabilities. Businesses today are more aware than ever of the value of including people with disabilities in their workplaces. And though people with disabilities have been negatively impacted by recessions, the economy, it ebbs and flows. So, uh, new federal hiring initiatives, God willing, would also facilitate employment of people with disabilities. There's also, of course, there's a lot of technologies that are available now that were not available, man, even 2 years ago, especially with this new DOJ rule on web accessibility. The digital accessibility world is just like exploding in its evolution. So every single day, there's new and better technologies to help enable remote work options and facilitate more effective workplace accommodations. So the when you're looking for jobs as a person with a disability, it's not just about your disability in itself. So a lot of times job seekers with disabilities encounter and hear from others this mindset that is so regressive that you're lucky to get any job or that there are certain jobs only that are appropriate for a person with a disability. And this is a really ableist assumption, of course. And underlying this assumption is this idea that people with disabilities have to take what they can get in the labor market. People with disabilities are in all professions and every labor market sector. So for people with disabilities, the same as with anyone else, your talents, your skills, your interests, experience, education, and your aspirations matter. The same as with any person without a disability, the job search really should start with an exploration of what are you good at? What do you love to do? And then you start moving towards how can you be paid to do those things? There's no guarantees for anyone that will get the exact job that fits our skills, interests, and temperaments. Job searching, of course, it always involves compromises of one kind or another. But if you really have an image of what you want to do, what you're called to do, then there's something there that you should be paying attention to in the job seeking process, whether or not you have a disability. Uh, some people might be concerned that job seekers today in the current market don't have the luxury of taking a job that fully 100% matches their interests and talents. Of course, or that looking at this will give you a false hope that you're going to get your dream job. Um, no one in this economy can expect that you'll always get your dream job, but your hopes and dreams matter. What you care about for your career, it matters. You may not be doing exactly what you imagined, but you might be doing something that still fits that bill, that gives you that same sense of fulfillment, that gives you a sense of, I did something good today at the end of the day. So this is really it's something that I want to emphasize. Too often, the job seeking process for people with disabilities has only been about the disability. But if you have a really persistent idea of what you want or need to do, then that's something you should be paying attention to. So find and define that spark. So some of there are some really specific provisions of the ADA in Title I, the first section of the ADA that deals with employment that pertain to the job seeking process. So this is just like a very broad look at that. And the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has a policy document that goes far more into detail about that than I ever could. And this is another link that I know definitely works. This is the do's and don'ts of employers uh, pre-employment medical examinations and medical related questions. So that might be helpful. But every part of the hiring process must be made accessible. So from submitting an application to interviewing to complying with those medical examinations, etc. Accommodations have to be provided to participate in the hiring process. Uh, there cannot be disability inquiries made during the hiring, but an applicant can choose to disclose. And applicants can be asked to to demonstrate how they would perform an essential job function. But it's also fine for you as an applicant to say that I can do this with X, Y, and Z accommodation, and here's how. And then applicants can be asked to explain gaps in work history. But in that explanation, it's not required that you disclose your disability. So again, it is such a personal choice to disclose or discuss a disability during or after hiring. And that is a legally protected choice. You do not have to tell a potential employer about your disability, even when you know that you will need an accommodation if hired, even when your disability may impact your job. Uh, so whether you disclose or discuss the disability when applying, you still have a right to reasonable accommodation if you are hired. This is really key. A lot of job seekers don't understand that if you do not disclose, you still can disclose after you've been hired and request an accommodation at that point. So you do not need to disclose in the hiring process to be eligible for accommodation. You can wait until after you are hired and then at that point. And then we have the do's and don'ts. I think I shared, yeah. So the do's and don'ts of disclosure through Jan are really, really good here. When thinking about like, what should I do? What should I not do? So w- some people may choose to disclose and some people may not. Um, the most obvious one is when a disability is an apparent. Uh, so you may choose to disclose your disability when it's an apparent disability, because you may be fearful that the employee may hesitate to hire if you don't address it, right? The elephant in the room. But when a disability is non-apparent, when it's a non-visible disability, you might not want any surprises if you're hired. You might trust the hiring manager that you're working with, right? You might feel that it's a safe environment to do so, and you might not want to live a hidden life of hiding this aspect of yourself. But some people may not want to disclose out of fear that they won't be hired if they don't trust the employer yet. They don't think it will impact their job at all, right? They don't need to request accommodation, so why disclose disability? Or if they believe that their disability is a private matter. And we're going to go through some case studies later in these slides that will kind of go through the disclosures process. So this may be a good one to call back to when we're going through those case studies. So unfortunately, I wish this wasn't the case, but job application processes, not all of them are compliant, right? And we saw it in the chat already. Um, Many job seekers with disabilities are going to face questions during the interview process that require or seem to require that you disclose your disability. As an applicant, it's really important that you answer employers' questions, but how you respond is up to you. Uh, so we have an example of an impermissible question. Do you have any disability that would prevent you from doing this job? So I want to so many questions that employers may ask that's inappropriate and not allowable. So they might ask about past hospitalizations, prescription medications, collecting workers' compensation, etc. And so you might want to think through the pros and cons for you personally of some of these ways to respond. So, if asked, do you have any disability that would prevent you from doing this job? You might want to go with the bold, strong. Title 1 of the ADA prohibits these questions. So I'm not able to answer that question for you today. Now that is a rather aggressive response, right? And especially in the interview room, it may not be the most comfortable for you. Maybe you want to state that you don't have a disability. Uh, Maybe it's not ideal, but it's an option. uh, it's unlikely that you don't fully know how or if your disability will impact the way that you're going to work. So maintaining that you don't have a disability might be a viable option in some situations, especially if you feel confident that you're not going to be requesting an accommodation. And even if you think you will need to request an accommodation, it's still a permissive response. They are asking an impermissible question. You're absolutely able to just go ahead and say, I don't have a disability. This third option here, when it applies, is probably the most desirable choice. So you're responding by saying, you know, you asking me that question really makes me think that you might be worried about my ability to do this job. Let me tell you why I think I can do this job and do it well. So this is a way to say, I see that you may be concerned, and here's why I don't think that that concern is valid. And you're not directly answering yes or no, but you're instead you're responding to their fears and you know telling them that fear is unfounded. So again, employers can't ask applicants whether they would need reasonable accommodation, because asking if you need reasonable accommodation is likely to reveal if you have a disability. Um, but it's a really complex and more difficult area of the law. So I would say if you have specific questions of that, we're going to call the ADA centers or look at the resources through the Job Accommodations Network. All right. So when you're thinking about preparing for the hiring process as a person with a disability, I've got two slides on this, and it's an overview of some of the issues that you might experience and want to think through prior to initiating the application process. So this is really a summary of things that we've already discussed. So think through yes or no, do I want to disclose? If yes, I'm choosing to disclose, do I want to discuss if I need accommodations or do I want to wait? Are you prepared to discuss possible costs for accommodations? And are you going to provide those helpful additional resources about tax credits or incentives? And how will you respond to possible questions and concerns about your disability? Now, again, these are things that you're thinking through personally, but you're not providing them without being prompted uh, to an employer, especially when we're talking about concerns, right? Don't give your employer or potential employer concerns that they have not already posed, because then you're going to plant seeds in their head that didn't exist. And this slide really is points that are applicable to any job seeker, disabled or not disabled. So you want to think about, are you able to and ready to discuss why you are competent and able to perform the essential job functions? Can you draw upon your past experience, educational, job, volunteer, to demonstrate how you can perform those functions? Can you explain gaps in your resume? And can you show that you have the technical and social skills needed to be effective in the job? So these apply to anyone, disabled or not, but you may think about them differently when you're thinking about your disability and your potential need for accommodation. So now we're going to go through a few real life examples. Uh, we're going to start with Carrie here, and then after we read the case study here, I'll ask about some questions, and you can drop your responses in the chat. So our first case is Carrie, 4 years ago, Carrie received her associate's degree in computer technology. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder 2 years ago and hospitalized for 3 months when she was first diagnosed. She hasn't worked since her diagnosis, but is now applying for jobs, and she got an interview. She doesn't think that she will need an accommodation if hired, but she is not sure. So, what are the key issues here with Carrie? She has a gap in employment. Yes, great. What else might she need to think about when she's starting the job process? Hospitalization question may come up. It's inappropriate if it does, but it might come up. And she needs to think about how she might respond to it. Yes, does she want to disclose? Perfect. So, what options does Carrie have in this situation? And what might be the consequences of disclosure? Yeah, she might need time off in the future. Yeah, that's true. So, when we're talking about explaining the gap in employment, potential inappropriate questions, medical questions, and disclosure, what are her options and what might be the consequences of that? She doesn't think she needs an accommodation. So, does she need to disclose? Yeah, no. Yeah, I'm seeing some head shakes, some no's. Even if she thinks she needs accommodations, remember, she still doesn't need to disclose, but especially because she doesn't think that she needs accommodations. Oh, good. Yeah, so she doesn't, but she could run into problems. Yes. So it's that choose to disclose before something becomes an issue. Yes. Absolutely. So it might require that she disclose so that if she starts exhibiting signs and symptoms of needing an accommodation, that her employer will be prepared for that and be aware of it so that it doesn't come to the fact where she has a negative performance evaluation or a write-up, and that they are at that point in time unaware of her disability. Yes, great. So in our next real life case, we have James. So James is a job seeker. He's looking for a job as a security guard. He's applied for a bunch of jobs. How common is that for all of us, right? You have applied for like literally 1 million jobs every single day, and you get auto rejected from all of them. And you finally get an interview with a company that is hiring security professionals for a large distribution center. Uh, Due to a childhood accident, James is an amputee and he uses a prosthetic limb for one of his legs. He walks with a slight difference, but his mobility is not restricted. So, again, what are the key issues here with James? Yeah. Miranda says in the chat, the most questionable thing about these cases is the fact that people are getting interviews. Yeah, Andy, absolutely. James's disability is visible to their employer, right? So he has a limb difference and walks with a slight difference, and so that may be visible to an employer. What options does James have in, yeah, deciding if he wants to disclose, talk about it? What options does James have in this interview? So he can choose, do I want to disclose? Do I want to talk about it? So in this case, James may want to disclose because, yes, can disclose and say that it will not impact or affect mobility, show their ability to perform the task. Yes. So in this case, James may choose to address the disability, especially because it's a visible disability, and go ahead and preempt any concerns by talking about their ability to perform the job. All right, and our last real life case here is Sarah. I promise this isn't about me, just a coincidence. But Sarah has just completed her college degree in accounting. She's been called for an interview. I'm sorry that all these people have been called for interviews. She's been called for an interview with a medium-sized company and is excited about the opportunity. Sarah has paraplegia and uses a wheelchair. She did not disclose her disability when scheduling the interview and is not sure whether the interview is wheelchair accessible, but she thinks it is. So, what are the key issues here for Sarah? Getting to the interview. Yeah, can she access the interview? Yeah, the work location and the interview location may be different. So maybe the interview is accessible, but the work location is not. Deciding if she should ask, yeah, because it might mean an inherent disclosure. Yeah. So this one, Sarah has a visible disability. She's a wheelchair user. She has paraplegia. And so she could choose to go into the interview without making any sort of disclosures, but it will be apparent when she's in the room that she does have a disability. So in this case, she may choose or she may not choose to ask in advance about wheelchair accessibility and talk about her disability in that case. I think that it would also be important for Sarah in her preparations for the interview to make sure that she is prepared to discuss her ability to perform the essential functions of the job because there may be concerns that exist. Now, again, she's not going to say, I know you're worried about X, Y, and Z. She's going to say, this is why I can do the job. This is how I can do the job. So we're not bringing up the concerns. We're bringing up how we're going to do something, what are our capabilities, and what accommodations might we need to do them. So that's the end of my slides. But I do have one other resource that I just wanted to show you in terms of examples. So the Job Accommodations Network has this cool tool. It's called Situations and Solutions, and they allow you to filter by different disabilities to look at various situations and solutions. And I filtered just by POTS, so that we could look at some situations and solutions that were specific to people with POTS as an example. So I'm going to share my screen here. And we have three more examples here that are specific to POTS. So in this first one, we have a healthcare case manager, and they experience a drop in blood, but they do experience a drop in blood pressure if she stands or walks for long durations. When this occurs, she needs to sit down so that she can prevent uh, fainting. So the healthcare facility that she worked in already had grab bars, which helped stabilize her, but they also moved her. So they relocated her desk location to an area of the facility to limit walking and provide her with close access to her needed work-related equipment. In the second example, we have a new hire with POTS, and they're beginning training for a hotel receptionist position. The training program required long hours for multiple days, like we've all been in these trainings where it's like 10, 12 hours for like 3 days in a row, and it's insane. The employee was able to perform the job tasks, but sitting in those trainings, that's not what you're doing for your job. So just sitting for those long hours in the training caused her to feel dizzy. So the employee in this case requested an accommodation, and the employer staggered the training schedule to allow her to sit in the training in the mornings and then job shadow in the afternoons, so that she could minimize her symptoms and complete the training. And lastly, we have a state outreach coordinator with POTS, and they experience low blood pressure while sitting in traffic during her commute to the work site for team meetings. She was able to perform her job tasks from home, but meetings were held on site. And unfortunately, this employee fainted while driving on her way to one of these team meetings. And after doing so, she requested remote meetings as a form of reasonable accommodation. The employer approved the request for monthly meetings and scheduled quarterly meetings ahead of time so that she could better arrange for transportation. So these are just a few more examples that I think might be more specific and more helpful. But I do want to spend some time answering questions now. So I will turn it, I have not been reliably looking at the chat, so I'll turn it over to Sally and Emily to help me, and we'll go through some questions.
Emily has been doing a great job of like sorting through our previous the questions from signups and figuring out what's been answered and what hasn't. So thank you, Emily. Okay, so to get us started, RTO seems to have really taken a hold of the market, and employers are specifying that employees must be on site for X number of days to perform many roles. Are there any protections at all for people with disabilities to still apply, or are we just not able to apply for these roles?
Yeah, so if the requirement is for a certain number of days in office, my question to the employer is, what are you doing in those days in office? Is everyone there and you're performing some sort of activity that requires you to be in person? Because if you can perform all of those essential job functions without being in the workplace, then it's still reasonable that you would be able to request remote work for more than those number of days or for all days as a reasonable accommodation. So again, it's about the essential job functions. And if the essential job functions don't require you being in person on site, then they need to consider remote work as an effective, reasonable accommodation.
Okay, thank
And
you.
so I would say don't scare yourself from applying for something just because it says that you need to have a certain number of days. If it says that it's all in person, then maybe that's because of the essential functions of the job. But especially that like, oh, you need to be on site 3 days a week. It's like, why 3 days a week? Is like that seems rather arbitrary.
Yeah. Okay, helpful. Should we ever offer to pay for our own accommodations if it is pretty expensive? For example, dragon dictation, medical scribe, etc.
So I would say in general, no. The responsibility to provide accommodations is on the employer. If it gets to the point where they're saying, oh, well, this dragon dictation, for example, is too expensive, but we can provide X, but you really like, you're like, oh, I'm going to refuse X, but I would rather just provide it. That's your choice. But in general, I would not offer to pay for an accommodation. No, that is not your responsibility. You're performing a service to the employer, not the other way around.
Thank you. What can you do if you believe you were eliminated from a job interview or recruitment process because of your disability or need for accommodation?
Yeah, so this one is tough because it unfortunately it requires you to be willing to kind of get into it for a long haul. So there are definitely portals for filing complaints. Here in the state of California, we have the California Civil Rights Division, and so you can file complaints through them. Let me just pull up. So you can file complaints through the California Civil Rights Department. And I think that that's always, for people that live in California, that's always my first recommendation before going to any federal government entities, just because we don't know who's sitting in offices in the federal government responding to or not responding to complaints. But there are also avenues for filing complaints for discrimination through the US DOJ. And so you can contact the Department of Justice to report civil rights violations as well. And I will drop a link there for you as well. Let me just pull it up here. And
Honestly, thank you for all the links and the resources.
yeah, yeah, it's a lot.
Awful.
It's absolutely a lot. And so, but you can go through the complaint process with that employer and you can say I'd like an appeal. And sometimes if you talk about the fact that you're alleging disability discrimination, that may be enough to reconsider. But um, unfortunately, not all people are good or lawful or ethical or moral, and so it may require that you go through this process. Um, Based on different complaints and entities, there may be statutes of limitation. So it's in your best interest to file complaints, as soon as possible. So I would say check the various agencies, but a lot of times it says, within a year or within 3 years of experiencing the discrimination.
Helpful. Um, let's see what else. I think so. How can you be terminated due to a change in abilities?
Um, Possibly, yes.
Okay.
So it's about being able to perform those essential functions of the job. So if you are able to perform the essential functions of the job with accommodation due to a change in disability, then no, you cannot be terminated. But if even with accommodation, you are no longer able to perform those essential job functions, um, then at that point it would be looking into leave, reassignment, or potential job termination.
All right. So can an employee ask for accommodations to be modified during a flare-up of a condition?
Yes, absolutely. So the interactive process is ongoing. So if you have an accommodation in place or you didn't, but you've disclosed and that accommodation is no longer serving you, you need to take a look at it. Then you go back, you re-engage in the interactive process, and then you might want to share. I have these flare-ups, they're periodic. During these times where I'm having a flare-up, I may need these additional accommodations. The typical duration or frequency is X, Y, and Z to my knowledge, and I'll keep you updated if that changes.
Thank you. Do you have any tips on how to navigate finding a job after a dysautonomia diagnosis? I think there's so much uncertainty and with a with flares and things like that. Or any resources for work for home for people with dysautonomia?
So remote work, I wish I had more resources, but what I would say is my best advice to you is to know yourself. So you are the expert in your needs. And so when it comes to applying for jobs, requesting accommodations, choosing to disclose, it's really about understanding what impacts you have now, or to the best of your knowledge, you may have in the future. But just the same as we're telling employers that they can't have these preconceived notions or assumptions or fears and apply them to the accommodations process, so should you do the same. So don't let these fears of what the future may look like for you stop you from engaging now. You kind of deal with those things as you take them, but don't let something that you're afraid might happen someday in the future stop you from doing something that you're really passionate about today.
Okay, does an employer have to grant access to your service dog if it does not interfere with your job or the nature of the business?
Generally, yes. Employment accommodations also might include not only service animals but emotional support animals. So it's again, it's part of the interactive process. And for service animals, what some employers may choose to do is they may choose to have trial periods where you have like, between a week and 6 weeks where you're bringing the animal into the office to make sure that it doesn't pose any sort of undue hardship or fundamental alteration. So that's totally reasonable for them to say, let's do a trial and see how it works out. Um, Things that are not suitable reasons to not allow a service animal is if someone else is fearful of dogs or allergic or something like that. Um, that's not a valid reason to not permit your service animal into the workplace.
Thank you. So who decides that it is essential for an employee to be present in the workplace to perform a job? And are there any ADA or legal guidelines for that?
It's the employer who decides what's essential, but it should also be like, you know, oftentimes you'll have a job description and it lists your essential duties. And if those essential duties involve tasks that are in person, like welcoming people into the office or meeting with stakeholders or um, you know, preparing for technical public presentations and it requires you to set up equipment. Like all of those essential tasks, it is implied that that is in person, right? Because I cannot set up the technology equipment for a meeting remotely. I cannot welcome people into the office remotely. I need to do that in person. So it may not be explicitly stated. Like sometimes jobs will say this is an in-person job, and that you can still ask, but it may be that that's what they have dictated and that's what they've chosen. But if you have like a job where you could be sitting at your desk and taking Zoom meetings and Teams meetings from anywhere, and you could be sending emails from anywhere and writing reports and reading content, then it's likely that the nature of your job, it's not essential for you to be in person in the office. So again, it's individualized and some of it is up to the employer to determine. So they do have a good amount of latitude here.
I just want to check in since I know we're at 129. We have a few more questions, but you've given us so much of your time, Sarah. So
Oh, I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes. That's fine.
thank you. I really appreciate that. Okay, so for how long does an employer have to hold someone's job who is out on leave under ADA, and can an employee out on leave be terminated?
So that goes into some of the differences in protection. So FMLA is going to be your job protections, um, and your leave protections and things like that. So that's where you're going to look for protections in the workplace for how long you can be out on leave. Like you're going to look into your short and long-term disability provision. So that goes into some other laws. The ADA doesn't state that there's any sort of minimum or maximum.
Okay, that's helpful. And is the FML, is that variable or is there?
So FMLA, generally you qualify, I think it's like the 12 weeks of annual leave where it's a job protection, but I'm not an expert in that. That's
Yeah,
like
no
getting more
worries.
into HR, so I don't want to say the wrong thing and give you bad
All good. I
advice.
appreciate that. No, thank you. So helpful. Okay, so question says, I often see phrases in a job application like you need to be able to stand for X hours or need to be able to lift or carry a certain number of pounds. How do you recommend approaching those questions?
So that's like pretty standard OSHA language. Like you need to be able to lift 50 pounds or 35 pounds.
Mhm.
This requires prolonged sitting or standing. It's can you have accommodations that would still allow you to do that? Um, you know, uh, if you need to sit or stand, can you have a stool? Can you have access to things that would allow you to perform that job duty? So it may be that you don't want to just completely not apply. You may still want to apply. Um, and then you go through the process and see what that actually dictates. Um, are you lifting 50-pound boxes all the time? Or are they just saying that an ancillary duty may be moving files from one place to another, where you could do it in shorter stints or with less at a time, or you could reassign that task to somebody else because it's not an essential job duty.
Thank you. Do you have to have a government acknowledged disability to get accommodation, or can a diagnosis from your doctor of your disability be enough to request an accommodation?
So there's no list of disability. You can't like go on Google and say government disabilities list checklist and find an exhaustive list. It's not about the disability itself. It's about whether that disability impacts your ability to perform your major life activities. So yes, absolutely. It's the doctors or the caregivers or the professionals' opinion that's saying that you qualify for disability-based protections.
Thank you.
Yeah, you don't
Um,
need to have like some sort of official terminology. Like you don't have to give them my diagnosis, like it can be a letter from a doctor.
okay, great. Are there guidelines on accommodations for pacing needs, especially in a work environment that's more fast-paced by nature? Is that considered reasonable or a case of reconsidering job options?
So it would depend. Like just a lot of jobs will say like this is a very fast-paced environment. Um, if the essential nature of your job is completing daily quotas and you're unable to complete those daily quotas, then it may be a look at reassignment or things like that to something where you would be able to perform. Um, but if it's just like we expect that you respond to emails quickly, uh, that might be something that you can look into an accommodation for. So it's really variable based on the job, based on what they define as fast paced. There may be sometimes where it may be that it's that fast pace is really actually an essential nature, or it might be just company culture.
Thank you. Um, do you have any tips on how to address work gaps due to illness in a resume?
So this may not be the most morally or ethically, but something that I saw recently, this is like, you know, not my professional advice, but I saw something funny that was like it's really none of a potential employer's business about your resume gaps. And something you can always say is that you signed an NDA and you can't discuss it.
I
So
love that.
yeah, so there are creative solutions that are out there that exist for why you can't explain it, but you can always say, I was caring for myself or a family member. I was learning new skills, education. That there are a lot of different reasons why there may have been a gap in your resume that don't involve disclosing your disability.
Okay. Awesome. So, okay, one last question, I think, and then we'll wrap it up. What if you have symptoms that are not yet diagnosed, and the diagnosis can take years? So, if you don't have that like official diagnosis yet, how do you approach disclosure?
Yeah, so it may be more difficult because at that point you may not be considered like within the legal. landscape the qualified individual with a disability. So it may be, I mean, you can always ask because it may be that your employer doesn't require medical documentation, but it is well within their rights to request that medical documentation. And so if you're unable to provide it from a doctor or a therapist or some sort of caregiver, then you may run into issues with qualifying for ADA accommodations. But that's not to say that you can't say still that it's a simple workplace request and can you help me out? So you can still engage in some sort of interactive process because again, a lot of times employers don't know that they're engaging in the official interactive process. Yeah, having a note from your doctor saying that you are experiencing symptoms, and that those symptoms require a an accommodation in the workplace may be different than a diagnosis. So they may still be willing to say, yes, this person is experiencing these symptoms, and due to these symptoms, they need X workplace accommodation, even without putting to paper any sort of name of a diagnosis.
Awesome. Well, you have answered so many of my questions and have provided so much fantastic information and so many resources. And that we will be sending out, Sarah has provided a number of awesome resources that we will be sending out via email. And this is recorded, so you can review all the awesome info. But yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. We're really so grateful for your time and for sharing your expertise.
Of course. Thank you, everybody. And feel free, Emily, Sally, to give my email, phone number if folks want to get in touch. I'm always happy to help you hunt down additional resources.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone who asked awesome questions and for being here and for being a part of the LADN community. Hope you all have a really great rest of your day. And yeah, thank you again, Sarah.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye bye.